He broke her arm right there on the street without even asking her name. But he didn't know who her father was. Don't turn it off. You have to see what happened next. Subscribe and write in the comments where you're watching from. The afternoon sun cast a soft amber light over the neighborhoods of Austin, Texas, as Danica Norris stepped out of her karate dojo. The scent of warm asphalt and freshly cut grass mixed in the air. Dressed in her crisp white gi with her black belt neatly tied around her waist, she looked confident, focused, and composed, every bit her father's daughter. At 13, she was already earning local recognition for her discipline and skill, frequently defeating older opponents in tournaments and maintaining top grades in school. She didn't like attention, though. She liked order. Her father had taught her that real strength was quiet. The streets were calm, lined with trees whose leaves danced in the breeze. Danica walked briskly, her gym bag slung over one shoulder. Her father wasn't home that day. He was in Houston hosting a seminar for veterans and self-defense instructors. Danica didn't mind walking. It was just 6 blocks to their house, and she liked the solitude. She passed by families chatting on porches, kids playing basketball in driveways, and joggers with earbuds lost in their rhythm. A black and white patrol car slowed as it turned the corner behind her. She didn't pay much attention at first. Police cars were common around the area, especially in recent months when crime reports had picked up in surrounding districts. But as the vehicle came closer, Danica could sense something was off. The cruiser kept pace with her steps, inching forward slowly until it pulled up beside the curb. She glanced to her left. The driver, Officer John Hauser, leaned out of the window. Mid-40s, pale, with a shaved head and permanent smirk etched onto his face. He adjusted his sunglasses slightly and looked her over, not with concern or professionalism, but with a mix of superiority and suspicion. "Where you headed, young lady?" he asked, his tone laced with forced authority and veiled condescension. Danica stopped and turned toward him politely. "Home, sir. It's just down the block." "Uh-huh. You got some ID on you?" She blinked. "No, sir. I'm 13. Hauser's smirk didn't fade. Instead, he opened the door and stepped out of the cruiser, his boots thudding against the pavement with deliberate weight. He walked around the front of the car and stopped just feet away from her. Danica stood her ground. "Name?" he asked. "Danica Norris." He raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Norris, huh? You trying to be funny?" She shook her head. "No, sir. My father is Chuck Norris." At this, the officer scoffed. "You expect me to believe that?" "I'm telling the truth." He stepped closer. "Well, Danica, I don't see any proof, and you fit the description of someone I'm supposed to stop. So hands where I can see them." Danica hesitated. "I haven't done anything. I'm just going home from karate." "Don't get smart," he snapped, suddenly grabbing her wrist. The move was swift and unprovoked. Her instincts kicked in and she tried to pull back, but his grip tightened with brutal force. She gasped in pain. "Let go, please! You're hurting me!" But he didn't let go. He twisted her small wrist behind her back, his strength overwhelming her frame. The next moment was sharp and terrible. A loud crack echoed in the empty street. Danica screamed and collapsed to the ground, her arm bent in a direction it should never have gone. The gym bag fell. Her water bottle rolled into the street. Her cries were high-pitched and panicked, and Hauser stood above her, breathing heavily, as if annoyed. "That's what happens when you don't listen," he muttered. Several houses away, a woman screamed from a porch. A man pulled out his phone and began recording. Hauser noticed but didn't react. He reached for his cuffs as though she were a criminal, but stopped halfway. For a moment, he looked down at her, saw the tear-streaked face twisted in agony, and decided she wasn't worth the paperwork. Without a word, he got back in his cruiser and drove off. Danica lay trembling on the sidewalk, her arm pulsing with searing pain. Her mind spun, but something inside her clicked, a reflex her father had trained into her. With her good hand, she reached into her pocket and pressed the two side buttons on her phone simultaneously. She held them for 3 seconds. The phone vibrated once and immediately began recording audio. At the same time, it sent her exact location and a live stream link to a secure emergency contact, her father, Charles Chuck Norris. Back in Houston, inside a crowded auditorium filled with applause and veterans in uniform, Chuck was mid-sentence when his phone buzzed in his pocket. He felt it through his jacket, a unique vibration that he and Danica had tested together dozens of times but never used in real life. He paused. Slowly, he pulled out the phone and saw the screen. Emergency signal received from Danica, live audio feed active. He turned away from the podium and brought the phone to his ear. What he heard stopped his breath. "Hurts." He broke it. "I told him my name, my dad's name." Then silence, then crying. Then another voice, deep and unfamiliar, cold. "Should have listened the first time." Chuck's hand clenched around the phone. The auditorium was still applauding, but his world had shifted. Without a word to anyone, he turned and walked off stage. Back in Austin, Danica was found by paramedics, her phone still transmitting. They transported her to Seton Medical Center, where she was admitted under pediatric trauma unknown injury. The staff worked quickly. X-rays confirmed a midshaft radial fracture, a clean break that would require stabilization and weeks of recovery. A nurse cleaned the blood from her scraped elbow and gently asked, "Do you know your parents' contact number?" Danica shook her head weakly, then whispered, "He already knows." By the time Chuck reached the hospital, having driven 200 miles in less than 2.5 hours, Danica was sedated, her arm in a temporary cast. The doctors greeted him solemnly, already aware of his identity. They took him aside and explained the extent of her injury, the medical plan, and how they didn't yet know the full circumstances. But Chuck knew. He had the recording. He had the timestamp. And more than anything, he had her voice burned into his memory. He broke it. He walked into the room quietly. Danica stirred as the door opened and looked up at him with glassy eyes. "I'm here," he said softly, kneeling beside her. "I told him who I was," she whispered. "I told him you were my dad." Chuck took her hand gently, trying not to squeeze too hard. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His silence was louder than rage. Outside the room, a nurse approached him cautiously. She was streaming audio for a while. "We didn't know at first, but I think you might want to hear this." She handed him a USB stick. Chuck nodded, tucked it into his coat pocket, and turned back to his daughter. "You're safe now," he said finally. "He's not." That night, while Danica slept under observation and machines beeped rhythmically around her, Chuck Norris sat in the hospital lounge, his phone in one hand and the USB stick in the other. He had a name, a face, a badge number, and he had heard the bones snap through the speakers. He stared out the window into the parking lot, jaw clenched, mind racing not with revenge, but with resolution. He had faced enemies before, on screen, in combat, in life, but this was different. This time, someone had broken a child who believed the uniform meant protection. This time, the fight wasn't in a ring or a film. It was real, and Chuck Norris was ready. The sterile hum of the hospital monitors pulsed gently in the dim light of the overnight wing. Chuck Norris sat motionless in the plastic chair beside Danica's bed, his posture relaxed in appearance, but inside him surged a quiet, controlled fury. His daughter slept deeply, sedated by the medication, her breathing even but shallow. A soft cast encased her forearm, running from wrist to elbow. Purple bruises bloomed just below the plaster, a cruel testimony to the violence she had endured. Chuck didn't sleep. He barely blinked. His hand rested lightly on Danica's fingers, as if grounding himself to reality, as if the warmth of her skin was the only thing keeping the storm inside him contained. Across from him on a tray table sat his phone, the screen dim, and beside it, a tablet where the hospital staff had uploaded the footage they had retrieved from Danica's phone. The recording had already been sent to his encrypted cloud and copied twice. Chuck Norris didn't make a move without having his bases covered. He had spent the past 2 hours listening to the audio on loop. Each replay etched the cop's voice deeper into his memory. Each sob from Danica tightened the coil inside his chest. When the first rays of Texas sunlight began to filter through the narrow blinds, Chuck stood slowly. He kissed Danica's forehead, adjusted her blanket, and stepped out of the room without a sound. In the hallway, nurses nodded respectfully, some offering quiet condolences, others merely giving him space. They had already heard whispers of who he was and what had happened, but no one dared ask questions. He moved like a man on a mission. And he was. Downstairs in the hospital parking lot, Chuck opened the door of his black 4Runner, climbed inside, and pulled out a worn leather-bound notebook from the glove box. He flipped it open to a contact list written in small, neat script. These were names he hadn't called in years. Military friends, intelligence analysts, retired law enforcement officers. He began dialing. The first call went to Hank Mendoza, a former U.S. Marshal with access to back-channel personnel databases. Within 20 minutes, Chuck had confirmation of the officer's full name. John Randall Hauser, badge number, recent assignments, and the disturbing revelation that he had multiple prior complaints for excessive force, primarily against minority suspects. All had been quietly dismissed or unsubstantiated. Chuck's face didn't move as he listened. When the call ended, he didn't speak. He simply tapped open a secure group chat on his phone labeled C4 and began uploading the files. Then he turned the key in the ignition and left the hospital behind. The drive to the Austin Police Department's downtown precinct was a short one, but for Chuck, every mile was measured in breath and patience. The building loomed ahead, glass and brick, modern and unimpressive. He parked across the street and sat in silence for a moment before stepping out. Dressed in jeans, boots, and a dark green button-down, Chuck didn't look like a celebrity or a martial arts legend. He looked like a father, and that made him more dangerous than ever. Inside the precinct, the atmosphere was busy but subdued. Officers moved through hallways and desks hummed with clerical work. Chuck approached the front desk calmly and stated his name. The young receptionist's eyes widened slightly before she composed herself and buzzed the watch commander. 15 minutes later, he was sitting across from Lieutenant Marcus Bell, a man in his early 50s with thinning hair and a nervous energy that grew more pronounced with each passing minute. Bell gestured awkwardly, offering Chuck coffee, which he declined. "Mr. Norris, I understand there's been an unfortunate incident involving your daughter." Chuck looked at him, not blinking. "You mean the assault, the broken arm, the cover-up?" Bell cleared his throat, and glanced down at a folder he had clearly only skimmed. The officer in question, Hauser, is currently on administrative leave while we investigate. Leave, Chuck repeated. It's standard procedure in cases involving use of force allegations. Was he even on duty? Chuck asked, his voice low, steady, and cutting. Bell hesitated. Technically, no. He was driving a patrol car without formal dispatch authorization. He used city property off-duty, detained a minor without cause, broke her arm, fled the scene, and you're calling this administrative leave? There was a long silence. We're handling it internally, Mr. Norris. Chuck stood up. You buried his last 3 complaints. I know, I've read them. I also have footage from the incident, both eyewitness and live audio from Danica's phone. You have until tonight to make this public, file charges, and suspend him pending a criminal investigation. If not, I will. Bell paled slightly. Mr. Norris, threats? This isn't a threat, Chuck said, stepping toward the desk. It's a warning. You don't get a second chance with my daughter. Without waiting for a reply, he turned and walked out of the room. His boots echoed against the linoleum floor, and no one dared stop him. By early afternoon, Chuck was back in the hospital. Danica had woken up briefly, smiling weakly when she saw him. Her cast had been reinforced. A nurse told him the doctors were optimistic about a full recovery, but Chuck knew physical wounds healed. It was the sense of safety that took longer to repair. As Danica drifted back to sleep, Chuck sat beside her again, but this time with his tablet. He opened an encrypted folder and reviewed the footage one more time. Then he added new images, a screen capture of Hauser's personnel file, a transcript of the complaint made by a Hispanic father 2 years ago about Hauser breaking his 10-year-old son's fingers during a stop and frisk. Nothing had come of it. Chuck uploaded it all into a secure drive labeled Hauser Evidence Pack and sent a private link to 3 contacts. One at the Texas Attorney General's office, another at a civil rights law firm in Dallas, and the last to a trusted independent journalist who owed Chuck a favor. He included one line with the files. They covered it up before. Let's see if they can cover this. Evening was setting in, casting orange light across the hospital windows when Chuck received a message from one of his sources. Hauser drinks every Wednesday night at 9 p.m. at a place called Iron Barrel off Montopolis Road. Private backroom. Badge buddies only. No uniforms. He brags a lot. Chuck put down his phone slowly. He looked over at Danica, sleeping soundly, her lips slightly parted, her small hand curled into a soft fist. He stood, stretched once, and picked up his jacket. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. He didn't need to. The storm inside him had found its target. As he stepped into the night, the air was cooler now, a wind whispering promises across the city. Chuck walked toward his truck like a man who'd done this before. Because he had. But this time it was personal. The Iron Barrel stood on the edge of Montopolis, rode like a stubborn relic from a past that had refused to move forward. It was one of those places without windows, with a door so thick it could have survived a hurricane, and regulars who didn't need to see outside because they already knew who belonged and who didn't. Chuck had never been there before, but the moment he pulled his 4Runner into the unmarked gravel lot, he recognized the type. Every town had one. A cop bar, no uniforms, no cameras, no questions. He parked under a broken floodlight and shut off the engine. In the seat beside him lay a small canvas duffel, its contents carefully chosen hours earlier. A compact lapel mic, an encrypted audio recorder, a concealed camera clipped into the seam of his shirt, and a sealed envelope with documents that could end careers. He wasn't carrying a weapon. He didn't need one. Chuck stepped out into the cool evening, the smell of beer, cigarette smoke, and worn leather seeping through the cracks in the door ahead. He crossed the lot, pushed open the door, and entered a space soaked in low light and years of sweat and secrets. Country music hummed from an old jukebox in the corner. A few men in faded jeans and tactical boots turned to glance his way, but quickly returned to their drinks when they saw nothing threatening. Just another aging man in a denim jacket with calm eyes and a quiet walk. He spotted Hauser instantly. The officer was in the back room as expected, seated at a long table with 3 other men. One older, built like a linebacker, one lean and twitchy with a trimmed goatee, and a third barely out of his 30s with a shaved head and a smug laugh. Hauser was at the head, relaxed, holding a beer bottle loosely and gesturing animatedly as he recounted something, his voice rising just enough to carry over the hum of conversation. Chuck walked slowly toward the back, slipping between tables, nodding once at the bartender who blinked at him with faint recognition but said nothing. The music shifted to a classic blues riff. When he reached the doorway of the back room, Chuck didn't announce himself. He simply stood in the threshold, watching. It was Hauser who noticed first. His words slowed, then stopped. He frowned, trying to place the face. A beat passed, then recognition dawned, and his eyes widened just a fraction before narrowing into mockery. "Well, I'll be damned," he drawled. "Chuck Norris, live and in person. To what do we owe the pleasure?" Chuck didn't answer. He stepped inside, letting the door swing shut behind him, and sat down at the empty chair at the far end of the table. The men shifted uncomfortably. Hauser leaned back, feigning ease. "You here to teach me some karate, tough guy?" Chuck's voice was calm, deliberate. "No, I came to ask a question." Hauser raised an eyebrow. "Shoot." Chuck's eyes didn't move from his. "Why did you break my daughter's arm?" The room fell into a sudden silence. The bartender glanced toward the back. The music seemed to dip just enough to make the pause feel heavier. The men at the table looked at one another, unsure whether to laugh or leave. Hauser exhaled and took another sip from his bottle. "She resisted," he said finally. "Didn't show ID. Talked back. Thought she was special." Chuck nodded once. "She's 13. She lied about her name. Said she was your kid. Thought she was being clever." "She told the truth," Chuck said. "Maybe." Hauser smirked. "Didn't matter. Mouthy little—" Chuck's fist struck before the sentence finished. It wasn't wild or angry. It was surgical. A straight right hook that caught Hauser on the side of the jaw, spinning his head sideways and knocking the bottle from his hand. It shattered on the floor. The other men surged to their feet, but Chuck was already up. He moved like he always had, precise, balanced, impossibly fast for a man his age. The biggest of the 3 lunged forward, but Chuck sidestepped, grabbed his wrist and flipped him face first into the wall with a sickening thud. The goateed man reached for something at his waistband, but Chuck kicked the stool out from under him and planted his boot on his chest, pinning him down. The 4th man, wisely, backed away, hands raised. Hey, I didn't do nothing." Chuck ignored him. He turned back to Hauser, who was staggering upright, clutching his jaw and snarling. Chuck grabbed him by the collar, slammed him back into the wooden wall hard enough to rattle the pictures on the shelf. "You grabbed a child," he said, his voice like gravel. "You twisted her arm until it snapped. Then you left her on the pavement like garbage. She resisted." Another slam. This time, the drywall cracked behind Hauser's shoulder. She was terrified. Hauser tried to punch, but Chuck blocked it easily, pivoted and drove a knee into his gut. Hauser collapsed to the floor, coughing, wheezing. Chuck stood over him, pulling the envelope from his jacket. He tossed it onto Hauser's chest. The cop stared up, dazed, and peeled it open with shaking fingers. Inside were printed copies of the witness videos, screenshots of social media posts, a full medical report signed by 3 ER doctors, and a lawsuit for assault of a minor. "Civil suit's already been filed," Chuck said. "Criminal charges are next." "You're out of your mind," Hauser rasped. "You don't have authority to—" Chuck leaned down, his face inches from Hauser's. "You don't understand who you hurt. This wasn't a drunk in an alley. This was my daughter." The back door opened. The bartender appeared, pale, holding a phone. "Cops are on the way," he said. "Someone called it in." Chuck stepped back, wiped a drop of Hauser's spit from his knuckles, and turned to leave. He paused once at the door. "Next time I see you in uniform," he said, "I hope it's during your perp walk." Then he was gone. By the time the squad cars arrived, Chuck was already 2 blocks away, slipping back into his vehicle. He didn't bother hiding his face. He wanted them to know. He wanted Hauser to know. The next morning, at 7:32 a.m., the footage from inside the bar was leaked anonymously to a whistleblower platform. Audio from Chuck's hidden mic synced with the timestamp security camera footage. The video captured Hauser admitting to twisting Danica's arm, mocking her, then being confronted, beaten, and served a civil lawsuit by a father who didn't flinch. Within hours, the video exploded across social media. Tens of thousands shared it with hashtags. #Justice. For Danica. #Chuck Strikes Back. #Broken Not Silent. Cable news picked it up by noon. Commentators debated whether Chuck's actions were justified. But one thing was universally clear. A child had been brutalized, and the system had looked away, until now. Danica watched it unfold from her hospital bed. A nurse wheeled in a tablet and showed her the trending clip. She didn't speak at first. Then, through cracked lips and teary eyes, she whispered, "He stood up." The hospital staff rallied. Nurses signed her cast with messages of hope. Doctors checked in more often than usual. Even a police officer assigned to the floor left quietly after seeing the footage. By evening, protests had begun to form outside the Austin Police Department. Not chaotic, not violent, just dozens of parents, teachers, activists, and neighbors holding signs, chanting quietly. Their presence spoke louder than words. Back at the hospital, Chuck returned to Danica's room. She was asleep again, a small smile on her lips. He kissed her forehead gently and turned to the window. His phone buzzed, a message from one of his allies in the legal circuit. "They're stalling the charges, protecting Hauser. You'll need to go higher." Chuck closed the message and whispered to himself, "Then higher we go." The counterstrike had landed, but the war was far from over. Morning came with a stillness that felt unnatural. Outside the hospital window, clouds rolled in over Austin like a warning. Chuck stood alone in the corridor, watching the sky darken, his reflection faint in the glass. Behind him, nurses moved quietly, respectful of the tension that clung to the air like static. Danica was resting again. She'd smiled when he arrived that morning, stronger than the day before, but he saw the weight still sitting behind her eyes. He couldn't take it away, not with a lawsuit, not with his fists, but he could make sure she never had to carry it alone. Downstairs, the whispers had already begun. Officers talking in hushed tones at the precinct, city officials texting each other under conference tables, journalists hunting for deeper cracks in the facade. The footage from the bar had detonated like a bomb, and Chuck knew it was only the beginning. But the silence from the city's leadership was deafening. No press conference, no apology, no disciplinary action, just vague promises of an internal review, while John Hauser stayed hidden behind bureaucracy and cowardice. Chuck wasn't waiting for anyone to act. He sat in the hospital's family lounge, pulled out his laptop, and opened a secure portal. Inside it, a repository of documents, sworn statements from other victims of Hauser's abuse, all previously buried by the department. A Hispanic boy who'd been slammed against the locker. A young black mother who'd been dragged out of her car at a traffic stop. A 16-year-old with autism who was cuffed for not answering quickly enough. Every story had one thing in common: Hauser's name and a system that had let him walk free. Chuck compiled the evidence into a single file. Then he added a cover sheet with the title, Pattern of Protection, Officer John Hauser and the City's Complicity. He signed it digitally, stamped the date, and sent it to 5 recipients: the mayor's office, the Texas Attorney General, the Department of Justice, a civil rights watchdog group, and an investigative news outlet known for publishing what others were too afraid to touch. With it, he attached a personal message. You had your chance to act. Now the public deserves the truth. By noon, the report had gone live. The article on the whistleblower site was titled simply, Chuck Norris Breaking the Silence. Within minutes, it began to spread. Chuck stepped into Danica's room just as she was turning the pages of a sketchpad someone had brought her. Her drawings were shaky but alive, images of strength and healing. One showed a small figure with a cast on her arm, standing on a mountaintop. Another showed a man standing between a child and a towering shadow. That one's you, she said quietly, pointing. He smiled, sat beside her, and placed a hand on her shoulder. You're the one on the mountain. She grinned sleepily, then leaned her head against his arm. It was the last quiet moment they'd have that day. At 2:00 sharp, a knock sounded on the door. A young hospital administrator stepped in, visibly tense. Behind him stood 2 uniformed officers, one from Internal Affairs, the other from City Security. The administrator spoke first. Mr. Norris, there's been some concern about your presence. The city would like to ask that you refrain from public commentary while the investigation is ongoing. Chuck rose slowly, his expression unreadable. You're asking me to stay quiet while the man who broke my daughter walks free? It's for the integrity of the process, the administrator mumbled. Chuck stepped forward. You've had 10 years to run a process. What you've done is hide the rot. You can't silence me. You won't. The officers shifted uneasily, but neither spoke. One finally looked at the administrator, who nodded awkwardly and gestured for them to leave. Chuck shut the door gently behind them and turned back to Danica, who had been watching with wide eyes. Are they going to arrest you? She asked. Not today, he said. Outside the hospital, the protests had doubled. What started as a handful of concerned citizens had become a mass of determined voices. Parents with children, veterans in uniform, students with homemade signs, each person carried more than outrage. They carried the sense that this story was no longer just about Danica. It was about every time someone had looked the other way. One sign read, Protect children, not badges. Another, She could be mine. Chuck watched the crowd from the window and knew it was time to go further. He placed a call to his legal counsel and outlined his plan. He would launch a national platform, an initiative dedicated to exposing police misconduct, especially in cases involving minors and people of color. It would be called Shield Breakers. Its mission would be simple: uncover truth, deliver justice, and dismantle the silence. He would fund it himself if he had to. He wouldn't wait for permission. By the following morning, the press had caught up. CNN, NBC, Fox, even overseas outlets began reporting on the growing protests. Civil rights leaders called for a federal inquiry. Public figures voiced support. Celebrities tweeted with the hashtag #JusticeForDanica, and the story reached over 20 million views in 24 hours. But the Austin Police Department still hadn't responded. Chuck knew they were hoping it would blow over, that the crowd would thin, the press would move on, and he would step back. They underestimated what it meant for a father to be in this fight. He arranged a press conference himself. It was held on the courthouse steps under a gray sky. Danica watched from a secure car nearby, flanked by hospital staff and 2 trusted friends. Chuck approached the podium, dressed in a dark suit, his eyes steady, his voice like iron. "My name is Chuck Norris," he began, "and I'm not speaking as an actor or a veteran or a public figure. I'm speaking as a father." He paused, let the silence stretch. A man in uniform broke my daughter's arm. Then he left her, and the city that trained him, equipped him, and protected him, they stayed silent. He looked out at the sea of faces. "This isn't just about my child. This is about your children, about every family that has been hurt and told to wait. I'm not waiting anymore. And I'm not alone." The crowd erupted in cheers. Reporters shouted questions. Chuck stepped down without answering a single one. He had said what mattered. Back at the hospital, Danica clapped softly from her seat. The nurse beside her wiped away a tear. Inside the police department, however, the mood was shifting fast. Officers who had once stood beside Hauser now kept their distance. Some cleared their desks, fearing what would come next. Others, quietly, sent messages of support to the Shield Breakers website, already live and accepting whistleblower reports. Within hours, it received over 2,000 anonymous submissions. By nightfall, city officials convened an emergency session. The mayor's staff begged for restraint. The police chief insisted they needed more time. But the Attorney General's office had begun its own review, and the Department of Justice was considering opening a case. The tide had turned. Hauser, meanwhile, had vanished from public view. Reporters camped outside his home. Neighbors refused to speak to him. Online, he was infamous. Still, no official charges had been filed. Chuck knew what they were doing, stalling, waiting, trying to outlast the storm. But he had already lived through the worst part. And now he was the storm. He returned to Danica's side as the rain began to fall lightly outside the window. She was watching the news again. Her name was everywhere now. Her cast was signed by dozens, covered in encouraging words. Brave, strong, justice is coming. She looked up at him. Are they going to make him pay? He didn't answer right away. He knelt beside her bed, looked her in the eyes. "I don't know what the system will do," he said honestly. "But I know what we'll do. We'll keep going. We'll make noise. And we'll make sure the next little girl never has to be afraid to walk home." She nodded. "Then let's make more noise." Chuck smiled. That night, as the city trembled beneath headlines and outrage, as silence began to break under the weight of truth, Chuck Norris sat beside his daughter's bed and began building something that couldn't be ignored. They hadn't won yet. But they had taken away the silence, and the thunder had only just begun. By the time the courtroom doors opened on the first morning of proceedings, the line to get in had already stretched around the block. News crews crowded the sidewalks, satellite vans lined the streets, and protesters held signs just feet from the courthouse steps. Some came to show support. Others came to demand accountability. All of them were waiting for a moment that had taken too long to arrive. Inside the Los Angeles County Superior Court, every seat in the gallery was filled. Teachers, parents, activists, and veterans sat side by side with press and former victims who had come forward only after Danica's voice gave them the courage to speak. Chuck Norris stood silently with his legal team, his arms crossed in front of his chest, eyes fixed ahead. Beside him sat his daughter, Danica, her cast now removed, but her arm still supported by a brace. She wore a soft blue dress and a quiet expression, her eyes focused, her demeanor calm. It was her first public appearance since the assault, and the room stilled when she entered. People did not see a broken child. They saw something far more powerful, a survivor whose bravery had exposed the cracks in an entire system. Across the aisle sat John Hauser, thinner now, paler. His once cocky demeanor had been stripped down to the bare minimum of composure. He avoided the crowd, avoided the press, avoided Danica's gaze. Two defense attorneys flanked him, whispering constantly, glancing toward the bench with barely concealed anxiety. Whatever confidence he had carried into the bar that night was long gone. The judge entered, a stern woman with gray hair tied into a tight knot, her robe flowing as she took her seat and brought the court to order. With a deep breath, the prosecution began its case. They started with the call. No introduction, no build-up. Just Danica's voice, piped through the speakers with chilling clarity. "Please, I didn't do anything. Please stop. That hurts." Then the sound of her bones snapping. Gasps echoed through the room. Some people covered their mouths. Others turned away, unable to listen. The sound was sharp and brutal and undeniable. Chuck watched Hauser's face. The man twitched but didn't look up. For the first time, the pain he'd inflicted was no longer hidden behind a badge or a filing cabinet. It was right there in front of him, as raw as the day it happened. Next came the medical evidence. X-rays of Danica's arm, photographs of the bruises along her wrist and forearm, testimony from the ER physician who treated her. He described the nature of the break, the force required to cause it, and the psychological trauma he observed in the young girl's behavior. His words were clinical, but the impact was crushing. Then came the timeline. A precise reconstruction of the incident, built from GPS data, security camera footage, and Hauser's own patrol car logs. The court heard how Hauser had taken the vehicle without authorization, how he had deviated from patrol routes, how he had failed to radio in the stop, failed to call for medical support, and ultimately left the scene without filing any report. The defense tried to argue procedural misunderstanding, but the evidence was too overwhelming. Witnesses followed. A local teacher who had seen the aftermath from her porch, a teenager who had filmed the final moments on her phone, a paramedic who described Danica's condition when she was found, shivering in shock, clutching her phone like it was the last safe thing in the world. Each voice added another brick to the wall of truth rising against Hauser. And then came Lauren Carter. She was a former police lieutenant who had served in the same department as Hauser. She stepped onto the witness stand with steady steps and told the court what many had feared to hear, that internal complaints against Hauser had been filed at least 5 times during his career, and that, in every case, they were dismissed or sealed. She recounted pressure from command staff to avoid bad optics, how evidence would go missing, and how victim stories were routinely discredited. Her words were not emotional, they were devastating because they were matter of fact. Chuck listened carefully. Danica kept her eyes fixed on the witness, her expression unmoving. She had heard some of this before, but in that courtroom, surrounded by people who finally listened, it carried a new weight. The room felt heavier after every word. When it was finally time for Danica to speak, the tension became suffocating. The bailiff called her name and she rose from her seat. Chuck squeezed her hand as she passed. She walked slowly to the stand, climbed into the witness box, and faced the courtroom. A hush fell like a blanket. She was asked to state her name. Danica Norris, she said, her voice soft but unwavering. She was asked what had happened. She recounted the day step by step. The walk home, the patrol car, the questions, her polite responses, the disbelief, the hand on her wrist, the pain, the scream, the sound. She did not cry. She did not falter. And then she added something not in the records. I told him who I was, she said. I told him my dad's name. He laughed, and then he grabbed me harder. Her voice cracked only once, and even then it only made her stronger. When asked if she wanted to say anything else, she reached into her lap and pulled out a small piece of paper. It was a drawing, her own. A child with a cast standing in front of a crowd holding a sign. Above the figure were the words, "I'm stronger now." She held it up. No one moved. The judge's hand rested still against her chin. The bailiff lowered his eyes, and slowly, one by one, people in the gallery stood, not in applause, not in spectacle, but in solemn acknowledgment. For her pain, for her courage. Danica stepped down. Chuck met her halfway and wrapped his arms around her gently. Closing arguments came quickly after that. The prosecution outlined every failure, every abuse, every cover-up. They didn't portray Hauser as a rogue. They portrayed him as a product of a system that chose silence over accountability. Officer Hauser is not just a man, the prosecutor said. He is a symptom, a symbol of what happens when power goes unchecked. The defense tried to claim overreach, claimed media pressure and mob justice, claimed that Hauser was being made an example. The jury left to deliberate. 6 hours later, they returned. The courtroom held its breath as the foreperson rose. On the count of aggravated assault of a minor, guilty. On the count of abuse of authority under color of law, guilty. On the count of evading legal responsibility and fleeing the scene, guilty. Hauser didn't move. His eyes stayed fixed on the floor. He didn't look at the jury or the judge or the family he had harmed. The judge ordered him remanded immediately. He stood, was cuffed, and led from the courtroom without a word. Outside, the crowd erupted. Reporters flooded the steps. Protesters cheered. But Chuck, Danica, and their legal team walked out quietly, flanked by supporters. Danica looked up at her father. "Is it over?" she asked. Chuck shook his head. For him, yes. For others, we're just getting started. 3 weeks later, Shield Breakers opened its first regional office. The response was overwhelming. Thousands of submissions poured in. Retired detectives, civil rights lawyers, trauma counselors, and former officers joined the initiative. Investigations began in 4 other states. Within a month, Chuck and Danica were holding town halls across the country. They weren't campaigning. They were building. They spoke to students, to parents, to officials. They showed them the paper with Danica's drawing. They gave them a number to call, a place to send their truth. One evening, during a meeting in Chicago, a mother raised her hand. Her son had been arrested at 15 for walking home in the wrong neighborhood. He still flinched when a patrol car passed. She didn't ask a question. She just said, "Thank you." Chuck nodded. Danica looked at the crowd, her voice clear. "We're not doing this because we want to be seen. We're doing it so that no one else has to be." Back in Austin, the police chief resigned. 3 more officers were placed on leave. The mayor issued a formal apology. And for the first time, the city began reviewing every sealed complaint filed in the past 15 years. Danica's cast was gone. Her arm healed, but something else had taken its place. She was no longer the girl whose arm was broken. She was the girl who helped rebuild justice, and her voice would never be silent again. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Check out our next videos for stories that matter, and share this one with someone who needs to hear it.